Professor Krell adjusted his triple-jointed limbs behind the lectern and surveyed his classroom with the practiced eye of someone who had been teaching tactical warfare for over 2 centuries. The Galactic Military Academy on Station Zenith 7 had seen its fair share of interesting students, but this semester's Advanced Combat Strategy class was proving to be, well, peculiar. The Vorthan cadets in the front row were practically vibrating with excitement, their scales shifting from deep purple to electric blue as they competed to answer every question before he even finished asking it. "Professor! Professor!" they hissed in unison, waving their clawed appendages like overeager children at a candy store. Typical Vorthan's mutts all flash, no substance. Behind them, the Chronari delegation had turned the simple act of note-taking into a full-contact sport, their rocky exteriors scraped against their seats as they elbowed each other for the best view, occasionally erupting into growling matches over who had the superior writing implement. One of them, Cadet Boulder-Face Modestly, Krell could never tell them apart, was currently flexing his biceps at his neighbor while simultaneously trying to take notes with a stylus that looked comically small in his massive stone fingers. The Etherian students floated in their designated hover zones, their translucent forms shimmering as they whispered telepathically among themselves. Even their silent conversations seemed loud somehow, filled with what Krell could only assume were boasts about their superior mental capabilities and complaints about having to share air with lesser beings. And then there were the humans. Sweet cosmic dust, the humans. They sat in the middle section like nothing Krell had ever encountered in his long teaching career. No preening, no posturing, no attempts to establish dominance through elaborate displays of species-specific superiority. They just sat there. Cadet Sarah Chen, a small, unassuming female, with dark hair pulled back in what humans called a ponytail, occupied the third row second seat. She had arrived exactly 3 minutes before class began. Not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to seem disrespectful. She carried a simple datapad and a writing instrument that looked ancient by galactic standards. Throughout the entire lecture on multi-vector assault formations, she had taken neat, methodical notes and asked exactly 2 questions. Both were relevant, both were thoughtful, and both were delivered in a tone so polite it made Krell's mandibles itch. Marcus Thompson, sitting 1 row behind, was even worse. The human male appeared to be paying attention, his eyes followed Krell's movements. He nodded at appropriate intervals, but he radiated all the excitement of someone waiting for paint to dry. When the Vorthans had launched into their usual heated debate about optimal flanking maneuvers, Marcus had simply continued writing, occasionally glancing up with what could only be described as mild interest. Elena Vasquez and James Park completed the human quartet of whatever this was. Politeness, boredom, some strange human form of mental deficiency. Krell's secondary brain began running probability calculations. In his 847 years of existence, he had taught thousands of cadets from hundreds of species. Every single one had displayed some form of competitive behavior, some drive to prove their worth, some indication that they possessed the killer instinct necessary for military service. Every species had their quirks, of course. The Vorthans were show-offs but cowards when actual danger appeared. The Chronari were brave but dumber than the rocks they resembled. The Etherians thought they were too good for physical combat and usually died first in any real engagement. But they all tried. They all wanted to prove something. These humans, though, they sat there like they were attending a lecture on agricultural techniques rather than learning how to efficiently eliminate their enemies. "Cadet Chen," Krell called out, his voice carrying just enough edge to make the Vorthans stop their chattering. "Perhaps you could share your thoughts on the tactical superiority doctrine we discussed." Sarah looked up from her notes, blinked once, nodded once, and said, "The doctrine assumes equal technological capabilities between opposing forces and relies heavily on psychological warfare to achieve victory through demoralization rather than direct combat effectiveness. It's adequate for most scenarios." Adequate. She had just described a military strategy that had won 17 major galactic conflicts as adequate. The Vorthans looked scandalized. The Chronari appeared confused. The Etherians probably would have laughed if they had possessed vocal cords. "And you believe you could improve upon this doctrine?" Krell asked, genuinely curious now. "I think most doctrines can be improved," Sarah replied with that same maddening politeness. But I'm here to learn, not to criticize. There it was again. That strange human tendency toward humility. Was that the word? Krell's species didn't really have a concept for it. The idea that a warrior would admit to not knowing everything was so foreign it made his head hurt. He tried a different approach. Cadet Thompson, what's your assessment of your chances against a Chronari opponent in single combat? Marcus looked over at the nearest Chronari cadet Rockhead or whatever his name was, who was currently doing what appeared to be push-ups while maintaining eye contact with the human. I'd probably lose, Marcus said simply. They're bigger, stronger, and their skin is basically natural armor. Would be a poor tactical choice to engage in single combat if other options were available. The Chronari cadet stopped mid-push-up, looking confused by the lack of challenge in the response. Krell found himself equally baffled. Where was the bravado, the trash talk, the inflammatory remarks designed to provoke a response? As the class period wound down, Krell watched his students file out. The Vorthins left in a cluster, still arguing about theoretical battle strategies they would never have the courage to implement. The Chronari stomped out individually, each trying to make their footsteps sound more intimidating than the last. The Etherians simply faded away, probably to go meditate on their own superiority. The humans gathered their belongings efficiently, exchanged a few quiet words among themselves, and departed without fanfare. Krell stood alone in his classroom, staring at the door they had just exited through, feeling like he had just witnessed something significant but couldn't quite put his finger on what. In all his years of teaching, he had never encountered students who seemed so detached from the competitive nature of military training. It was unsettling, wrong somehow. Perhaps it was time to do a little research into these peculiar creatures and their combat capabilities. After all, how dangerous could they possibly be? The faculty lounge on Station Zenith 7 buzzed with the usual post-class energy as Professor Krell made his way to his customary corner table. The establishment catered to beings from across the galaxy, which meant the air was a carefully balanced mixture of 17 different atmospheric requirements and smelled vaguely like burnt electronics mixed with swamp gas. Professor Thax, a towering mantoid with compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once, clicked his mandibles in greeting. Krell, you look troubled. Did one of your students finally challenge you to ritual combat? Worse, Krell muttered, settling into his specially designed chair. They're being polite. Commander Zephyr, an Etherian whose translucent form shimmered slightly in the artificial lighting, materialized at their table without making a sound. I take it, you're referring to the human delegation. Yes, I've noticed their unusual demeanor as well. Captain Grudge, a Chronari built like a walking boulder with anger management issues, slammed his massive fist on the table with enough force to rattle the other patrons' drinks. Those soft-skinned weaklings. They sit in my warrior's honor class like frightened pups. No roaring, no chest beating, no attempts to establish dominance. How are they supposed to strike fear into their enemies when they can't even intimidate a houseplant? Krell nodded grimly. Exactly my concern. In 30 years of teaching combat strategy, I've never encountered students so passive. They take notes, they ask reasonable questions, they thank me at the end of class. It's deeply disturbing. Perhaps, Zephyr suggested in that annoying way Etherians had of sounding wise while saying nothing useful. Their species simply lacks the warrior gene. Not every civilization produces effective soldiers. Look at the Fluffians, lovely beings, excellent at making pastries, absolutely useless in combat situations. Professor Scritch, a reptilian Vorthan whose scales were currently a nervous shade of yellow-green, joined the conversation uninvited. I've been monitoring their stress responses during my psychological warfare seminars. When I show footage of actual battlefield carnage, the kind that makes Chronari cadets faint and Vorthan students lose their breakfast, the humans just watch. Their heart rates barely increase. Either they're completely traumatized into catatonia, or what? Krell prompted. Or they're the most emotionally stable beings I've ever encountered, which frankly is almost more terrifying than the alternative. Grudge snorted, a sound like rocks grinding together. Stable, they're weak. In my homeworld, we have a saying, a warrior who doesn't boast has nothing to boast about. These humans never brag, never threaten, never even raise their voices. They're clearly the least dangerous species in the academy. Creel found himself nodding along with the general consensus. It made sense, really. Every successful military species had certain characteristics: aggression, competitiveness, a desire to prove superiority. The humans displayed none of these traits. "Well," he said finally, "there's one way to settle this debate. The combat simulation records are public information for all enrolled cadets. Perhaps we should review their performance data before we make any final judgments about their capabilities." The suggestion was met with various forms of agreement. Thax's antennae twitched with interest. Zephyr's form brightened slightly. Even Grudge looked curious, though that might have just been his normal expression of barely contained violence. "Excellent idea," Zephyr said, "though I suspect we'll find their combat scores match their classroom demeanor thoroughly mediocre." They made their way to the Academy's central database terminal, a massive crystalline structure that hummed with stored information from thousands of years of military training. Creel input his authorization codes and navigated to the student records section. "Let's start with Cadet Sarah Chen," he decided, pulling up her file. "She's been perhaps the most aggressively polite of the group." The others gathered around the display screen, their various forms of eyesight focusing on the data that was about to load. Creel expected to see exactly what their classroom observations had suggested: average scores, mediocre performance, the kind of unremarkable results that would confirm their suspicions about human military potential. His finger hovered over the Combat Simulation Results tab. "Prepare to be underwhelmed," he muttered, and clicked. The screen flickered for a moment as the data loaded. Somewhere in the background, the usual sounds of the Academy continued: students training, instructors lecturing, the hum of life support systems keeping hundreds of different species alive in the vacuum of space. Then the results appeared, and Professor Creel felt his world tilt slightly off its axis. The screen displayed Sarah Chen's combat simulation results with the cold, clinical precision that only military databases could achieve. Professor Creel stared at the numbers, blinked all four of his eyes in sequence, and stared again. "There must be some mistake," he said slowly. "Combat Simulation Alpha 7. Victory. Time to completion: 4 minutes, 23 seconds. Enemy casualties: 47. Personal casualties: 0. 4 minutes? Stax clicked, his compound eyes reflecting the screen's glow. "The Academy record for that simulation is 6 minutes 14 seconds, held by a chronary berserker who literally ate his way through the enemy positions." Commander Zephyr's translucent form flickered with what might have been confusion. "Perhaps the data is corrupted. Let me access the detailed breakdown." The screen shifted to show a tactical overview of Simulation Alpha 7, a standard urban warfare scenario designed to test a cadet's ability to clear hostile forces from a fortified position. The simulation typically took new cadets anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to complete, assuming they survived at all. The playback began. Cadet Chen appeared at the insertion point, a small figure against the backdrop of a war-torn cityscape. For exactly 37 seconds, she remained perfectly still, hidden behind debris while conducting what the readout labeled as environmental assessment. "She's just standing there," Captain Grudge rumbled. "Is she frozen? Afraid?" Then Sarah moved. What followed was not the kind of combat display they had expected from their polite, note-taking student. Sarah Chen moved through the simulation like she was conducting a symphony of destruction, each action flowing seamlessly into the next with mechanical precision. She didn't charge the enemy positions like a chronari warrior. She didn't attempt to overwhelm them with superior firepower like a Vortan assault trooper. She didn't even try to outmaneuver them with speed and agility like an Etherian scout. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She thought. The tactical overlay showed her route through the simulation in real time. Rather than taking the obvious approach routes, she had identified 17 different entry points, calculated the optimal sequence for neutralizing defensive positions, and executed a plan that seemed to anticipate every enemy movement before it happened. "Look at this," Professor Scritch hissed, his scales shifting to an alarmed shade of orange. "She's not just reacting to threats, she's predicting them." The playback showed Sarah placing small explosive charges at 3 seemingly random locations, then retreating to a position that offered no apparent tactical advantage. 30 seconds later, enemy reinforcements arrived via the exact routes she had mined, eliminating themselves with their own momentum. How did she know they would come from those directions? Krell whispered. The simulation continued. Sarah had somehow turned the enemy's own defensive positions against them, using their automated turrets to create crossfire zones that eliminated clusters of hostiles without requiring her to expose herself to return fire. When she finally did engage directly, her accuracy was disturbing. Headshot. 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 The targeting reticle barely seemed to move as she systematically eliminated targets with the kind of precision that would make a Vorthan sniper weep with envy. 96% accuracy rating. Tax read from the data stream. Under combat conditions. While moving, that's not possible. But it was happening right there on the screen. Sarah Chen, the same cadet who asked polite questions about theoretical doctrine, was moving through a combat simulation like death wearing a training uniform. The final sequence was perhaps the most unnerving. Faced with a heavily fortified position that should have required a full squad to assault, Sarah had somehow convinced the enemy forces to abandon their defensive advantage by creating the illusion of a much larger attacking force, using nothing but strategic noise placement and reflected laser fire. The simulation ended with enemy forces surrendering to what they believed was an overwhelming assault. The tactical computer's analysis showed that Sarah had never been in any real danger throughout the entire engagement. Victory achieved through deception, misdirection, and psychological manipulation. Total time, 4 minutes, 23 seconds. The faculty lounge had fallen completely silent. Even the background chatter from other tables seemed to have died away as if the universe itself was processing what they had just witnessed. Check another file, Krell said quietly. His voice sounded strange in his own auditory receptors. Maybe this is an anomaly, some kind of fluke. His claws moved across the interface, pulling up Marcus Thompson's record, the human who had seemed so disinterested in theoretical combat doctrine, who had readily admitted he would probably lose in single combat against a Chronari opponent. Combat Simulation Beta 12 Victory. Time to completion, 3 minutes 51 seconds. Enemy casualties 62. Personal casualties 0. 3 minutes. Captain Grudge's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested his worldview was experiencing structural damage. Beta 12 is supposed to be impossible for individual cadets. It requires coordinated team tactics. Krell opened the detailed playback with hands that he realized were shaking slightly. What they saw defied everything they thought they knew about human military capabilities. Marcus Thompson had essentially rewritten the rules of engagement. Faced with a scenario designed for team coordination, he had turned the enemy force against itself through a combination of electronic warfare, strategic misinformation, and what could only be described as psychological torture. He made them think their own commanders had betrayed them. Scritch whispered. His scales now a sickly shade of green. Look at the communications intercepts. He somehow hacked their command frequency and issued contradictory orders that caused a complete breakdown in unit cohesion. Krell stared at the screen, watching this quiet, polite human systematically destroy an enemy force that should have been able to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. The same student who had thanked him for the lesson and asked if there were any additional reading materials he might recommend. Pull up Elena Vasquez, he said hoarsely. And James Park. I need to see their records too. Because if this was what humans considered normal performance, then every assumption they had made about warfare, about combat capability, about the nature of military strength itself, was about to be completely rewritten. And Professor Krell was beginning to suspect that their quiet, polite human students weren't weak at all. They were something far more terrifying. They were competent. Elena Vasquez's file opened with the same bureaucratic efficiency as the others, but Professor Krell no longer trusted anything to be routine. The human female who sat in the back corner of his classroom, who had never once interrupted a lecture or challenged a fellow student to prove her worth, had just become a statistical impossibility. Combat Simulation Gamma 3 Victory. Time to completion 2 minutes 47 seconds. Enemy casualties 73. Personal casualties 0. Mission parameters: stealth infiltration and asset extraction. 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Commander Zephyr repeated, his translucent form now flickering rapidly between states of matter. The previous record was held by a Shadowkin operative. They're literally made of living darkness and can phase through solid matter. Professor Scritch's scales had progressed through the entire color spectrum, and were now settling on a disturbing shade of purple that usually indicated impending nervous breakdown. A human just outperformed a being who can become invisible at will, using conventional equipment. The playback began, and Krell watched Elena enter the simulation environment, a heavily guarded facility where she needed to extract a high-value target without triggering the alarm systems. Standard doctrine called for extensive reconnaissance, careful timing, and surgical precision. Most cadets spent the first 10 minutes just planning their approach. Elena spent 12 seconds observing the facility, then walked straight through the front entrance. "What is she doing?" Captain Grudge bellowed. "That's not stealth. That's suicide." But it wasn't suicide. Elena had somehow acquired a guard uniform. The tactical readout showed she had disabled a patrol unit outside the facility's scanning range in under 30 seconds and was now moving through the corridors with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. "Look at her biometric readings." Tast clicked nervously. "Heart rate, stress hormones, neural activity. She's completely calm. She's strolling through enemy territory like she's taking a walk in a park." The simulation showed Elena reaching the target location, bypassing 17 different security systems not through technological superiority or superhuman abilities, but through pure behavioral manipulation. She convinced guards to open doors for her. She persuaded technicians to disable security protocols voluntarily. She somehow made enemy personnel actively assist in their own facility's breach. "How?" Krell whispered. "How is she doing this?" The answer came from the psychological analysis overlay. Elena had identified each guard's species-specific social triggers and was exploiting them with surgical precision. She used Avorthan's tendency toward hierarchical deference to make him believe she outranked him. She triggered a Kronari's protective instincts by pretending to be lost and confused. She manipulated an Etherian's sense of intellectual superiority by asking for help with a simple problem that made him feel important. She extracted the target minor as a simulated prisoner who believed he was being rescued by authorized personnel and exited the facility through the same front entrance she had used to enter. Total time elapsed 2 minutes 47 seconds. Alarms never triggered, no shots fired, no violence whatsoever. The enemy forces never even realized they had been infiltrated. "This is impossible," Captain Grudge stated flatly. "No one is this good at reading people. It requires understanding dozens of different species' psychological profiles, social structures, behavioral patterns." Krell was already pulling up James Park's file with the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this one would show normal results. The human male who had seemed so ordinary, so forgettable, so perfectly unremarkable in every classroom interaction. Combat. Simulation Delta 5. Victory. Time to completion 1 minute 52 seconds. Enemy casualties, 94. Personal casualties, 0. Mission parameters. Asymmetric warfare against superior forces. 1 minute and 52 seconds. Against a simulation that typically took experienced military officers 20 minutes to complete, assuming they had the good sense to retreat before getting themselves killed. The playback showed James facing odds that should have been mathematically impossible to overcome. He was outnumbered 47-1, outgunned and trapped in terrain that offered no tactical advantages whatsoever. What followed was not combat in any sense that Krell understood the term. It was closer to artistry, deadly, efficient, absolutely terrifying artistry. James had turned the environment itself into a weapon. He triggered avalanches, redirected river flows, and somehow caused the enemy's own heavy weapons to malfunction in precisely the right sequence to create maximum chaos. He moved through the battlefield like he could see the future, always being exactly where enemy fire wasn't, always striking at the precise moment when defenders were looking the wrong direction. "He's not fighting them," Professor Scritch observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's conducting them, like they're an orchestra, and he's choosing what music they play." The simulation ended with enemy forces in complete disarray, their command structure shattered, their equipment useless, their morale non-existent. James Park hadn't just won, he had transformed a military engagement into a demonstration of superior tactical thinking that left his opponents questioning their career choices. Krell sat back in his chair, feeling like someone had just explained that gravity was optional, and mathematics was merely a suggestion. He pulled up the Academy's historical records, comparing the humans' performances against the all-time records for each simulation. Sarah Chen, second best time in Academy history. Marcus Thompson, first best time in Academy history. Elena Vasquez, first best time in Academy history. James Park, first best time in Academy history. This can't be right, he muttered, cross-referencing the data with species performance averages. Vorthons, despite their boastful nature, averaged in the 60th percentile for combat effectiveness. Chronari, for all their physical advantages, rarely broke the 75th percentile due to their tendency to smash things rather than think strategically. Aetherians performed well in individual categories but suffered from overconfidence that led to tactical errors. The humans weren't just outperforming other species, they were redefining what performance meant. Krell, Commander Zephyr said slowly, his form now flickering so rapidly it was difficult to focus on him. How long have humans been members of the Galactic Military Academy? This is their first semester, Krell replied automatically. They just achieved spaceflight capability 57 years ago. The Council decided to offer them probationary membership to see if they were ready for military cooperation. The silence that followed was profound and deeply uncomfortable. Probationary membership, Captain Grudge repeated. We're evaluating them to see if they're good enough to join our military alliance. Yes. And they just broke every combat simulation record in the Academy database. Yes. Using equipment and tactics they learned in the last 4 months. Yes. Another long silence. I think Professor Tak said carefully, we may have misunderstood which species was being evaluated. Krell stared at the screen displaying 4 human names at the top of every relevant performance category, and realized that his entire understanding of military capability species hierarchy, and the nature of warfare itself was currently undergoing what could only be described as catastrophic system failure. These quiet, polite, note-taking humans weren't students. They were professors. And everyone else in the academy had just been enrolled in a master class they didn't even know they were taking. The next morning found Professor Krell standing outside Combat Training Bay 7, staring at the entrance like it might explode if he looked at it wrong, which, given what he had learned about human capabilities, was not entirely outside the realm of possibility. He had requested a meeting with the 4 human cadets under the pretense of academic consultation, though what he really wanted was answers to questions that were keeping him awake during his normal sleep cycle. The humans arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late, just precisely when they had agreed to meet. They filed into the training bay with that same unsettling efficiency he had observed in their combat simulations. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Krell began, then stopped. How exactly did one ask a group of beings why they were pretending to be harmless when they were clearly the most dangerous students in Academy history? Is there a problem with our classroom performance, Professor? Sarah Chen asked politely. We've been trying to follow all Academy protocols. No problem with your performance, Krell said carefully. I was hoping you might help me understand your approach to learning. The 4 humans exchanged glances. It was a brief look lasting maybe half a second, but Krell caught something in it, a silent communication that suggested they had been expecting this conversation. What would you like to know? Marcus Thompson asked. Well, for instance, most species use classroom discussions to demonstrate their tactical knowledge, establish dominance hierarchies, prove their worth to instructors and peers. But you don't. Elena Vasquez tilted her head slightly. Should we be doing that? Most cadets feel the need to yes. It's considered normal military behavior. James Park spoke up, his voice carrying that same calm tone they all used. Professor, may I ask what our combat simulation scores look like compared to other students? Krell hesitated. Your scores are exceptional. Then why would we need to prove ourselves in classroom discussions? Sarah asked. We're not here to impress anyone. We're here to learn from you. The simplicity of the statement hit Krell like a meteor to the frontal lobe. Learn from us. Of course, Marcus said. You've been fighting galactic wars for thousands of years. You have tactical knowledge, strategic insights, historical perspectives we don't possess. We'd be foolish to waste time talking when we could be listening. Elena nodded. Every species here has different approaches to warfare. The Vorthons excel at rapid deployment tactics. The Chronari understand defensive positioning. The Aetherians have mastered psychological operations. We want to understand all of it. But your simulation results suggest you've already mastered most tactical concepts, Krell protested. James smiled, though a small, almost invisible expression. Professor, there's a difference between being able to do something and understanding why it works. We can figure out how to win a fight. What we want to learn is how to prevent fights from happening in the first place. When other students debate tactics, Sarah explained, they're trying to prove they're right. When we listen to those debates, we learn why different approaches work for different species. That's much more valuable than being right about one thing. Krell felt his understanding of the situation shift once again. So your silence in class isn't because you're passive or lack warrior spirit. We're processing, Marcus said simply. When a Vorthan argues that speed is more important than stealth, and a Chronari argues that strength trumps both, we're not trying to pick sides. We're figuring out when each approach would be optimal. You're treating the entire academy as a learning laboratory, Krell realized. Isn't that what it is? Elena asked. The professor stared at these four beings who had somehow turned military education inside out without anyone noticing. They hadn't been hiding their capabilities. They had been demonstrating their greatest strength all along. They learned. Not just facts or techniques, but systems, behaviors, patterns. They absorbed everything around them and synthesized it into something new. Tell me, Krell said slowly, what have you learned about us? The humans exchanged another one of those brief glances. That every species here is excellent at something, Sarah said diplomatically. And that most of them don't realize how excellent they are, James added. Because they're too busy trying to prove they're better than everyone else to notice what everyone else is actually good at, Marcus finished. Krell felt something that might have been respect beginning to form in his primary consciousness center. These humans had been studying not just military tactics, but military culture, military psychology, military sociology. They hadn't come to the academy to learn how to fight. They had come to learn how to understand fighters, and that Krell realized with growing unease was a far more dangerous skill than anyone had anticipated. Professor Krell walked into the faculty lounge 3 days later carrying a datapad and wearing an expression that his colleagues had never seen before. Respect mixed with something that might have been concern. The usual suspects were gathered around their customary table, taking nervously. Zephyr shimmering with barely contained curiosity, Captain Grudge looking like he wanted to punch something, and Professor Scritch's scales cycling through colors that suggested he was still processing their earlier discovery. Well, Commander Zephyr asked, did you speak with the humans? Krell set down his datapad and looked around the table. I did, and I think we need to completely revise our understanding of what's happening here. Are they some kind of advanced military specialist pretending to be students? Dax clicked hopefully. No, Krell said slowly. They're exactly what they claim to be, students. That's what makes them so dangerous. He activated his datapad, displaying the conversation notes he had compiled. They're not trying to prove anything because they don't need to prove anything. They're not competing with other species because they're studying other species. Every classroom debate, every training exercise, every casual interaction, they're treating it all as data collection. Captain Grudge's rocky features shifted into what might have been confusion. Data collection for what? For understanding how we think, how we fight, how we can be defeated, Krell replied. They've been conducting a comprehensive analysis of galactic military doctrine while we've been worrying about whether they were paying attention. The implications settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Professor Scritch's scales turned a pale shade of yellow. You mean they've been learning everything we know while revealing nothing about themselves, Krell confirmed. Until I checked their simulation records, I had no idea what they were capable of. None of us did. They've been perfectly camouflaged as harmless, polite students, while systematically absorbing every tactical advantage we possess. The faculty lounge had gone quiet around them. Word of the human simulation performances had begun to spread through the academy, and conversations were happening in hushed tones as instructors revised their assessments of the quiet species from the outer rim. Over the following weeks, the change in atmosphere was noticeable. Vorthan cadets stopped dismissing human opinions during tactical discussions. Chronari students began asking humans for advice on strategic planning. Etherian pupils actually requested joint study sessions to understand human analytical methods. The humans, for their part, continued being exactly as they had always been, polite, attentive and quietly terrifying in their competence. Professor Krell found himself watching them with new eyes during his lectures. When Sarah Chen asked a question about supply line vulnerabilities, he now understood she wasn't seeking clarification boon. She was testing whether his knowledge matched their simulated scenarios. When Marcus Thompson nodded thoughtfully during discussions of siege warfare, Krell realized the human was probably calculating 17 different ways to break any siege described. The Academy's training protocols began to shift subtly. Instructors found themselves explaining not just what worked, but why it worked, conscious that their human students were building comprehensive models of galactic military thinking. On the final day of the semester, as Professor Krell watched his students file out of the classroom for the last time, he noticed something that made him smile with his secondary mandibles. The other species were no longer trying to outshout each other or establish dominance through volume and bluster. Instead, they were quietly discussing tactical concepts, sharing insights, learning from each other. The humans had taught them something without saying a word about it, that listening was more powerful than speaking, that understanding was more valuable than being understood, and that true strength often wore the disguise of humility. As the last student left the room, Professor Krell updated his personal teaching philosophy in his data logs. Judge a species not by the noise they make, but by the silence they keep. The quietest students are often the most dangerous teachers. He paused, then added one final note. Request immediate review of human species classification. Recommend upgrade from probationary members to strategic partners before they decide we're not worth keeping around. Because if there was one thing Professor Krell had learned this semester, it was that underestimating humans was a mistake you only made once. Assuming, of course, they let you survive long enough to realize you had made it.